Welcome back to Movies and Cool Stuff. My name's David Craig and I recently finished watching Search Party Season 4 on HBO Max. So today we're going to be discussing all of the big things that happened in the latest episodes. Now consider this your warning, this video is going to be spoiler filled from the beginning, so if you haven't seen Season 4 yet, I recommend you do that first and then come back. Let's get started. So I thought Search Party Season 4 was pretty good overall. I'd say it's more or less on a par with the third season, but not quite on the level of the first two. Now there's a lot I want to talk about, so let's begin with the two main characters of this season, Chip and Dory. So I mentioned in my previous Search Party review that I wasn't really a very big fan of Chip, and that's because he came across like a really half-baked character in Season 3. And interestingly, I've since read an interview with the creators of the show, and they admitted that they didn't really have a firm idea of who this character was going to be when they were writing Season 3, so that really explains a lot. But I have to say, I like the character a lot more here in Season 4. I think Kolis Gozer plays a really interesting villain because he's not physically intimidating in the traditional sense, but there was still a real menace about him, and I was often very fearful for the people in his presence. And two of the most suspenseful scenes that really stand out in my memory is the scene where Dory is in the shower and she's desperately trying to escape by breaking open the window in the bathroom, and also, of course, how can we forget the horrifying death of Paula Jo. And because Chip was so creepy, it really succeeded in getting me back on Dory's side after Season 3, where she came quite close to being an outright villain. Some of her behaviour was very callous. But here in Season 4, I was really rooting for her, and my heart sank at the end of Episode 3 when she came so close to escaping, and then Chip found her and brought her back to the house. It was just a gutting moment. Overall, I liked Dory's journey this season. I found it very compelling, and Alia Shawkat was brilliant as always. But my one criticism would be that it felt a little bit rushed towards the end. That video message that she leaves for the gang while the fire is raging around her, it didn't feel entirely earned, because literally like one episode before she seemingly hated her life and hated them too. So it just kind of came out of nowhere. I want to take a minute now just to talk about the tone of Search Party, because I know that a criticism a few of us had with Season 3 is that it felt a lot sillier than the first two, which were both very grounded. Now I would say towards the beginning of Season 4 we were going back to that more serious tone of the earlier episodes, and that was in spite of the fact that the premise was a little bit more far-fetched, and I'm referring to how Chip somehow made an exact replica of Dory's apartment out of felt, down to the most minute details. I don't know how he managed that. I mean, logistically it's really perplexing, but it was believable enough. And the stakes felt very high, and that was the main thing. Unfortunately, I do think that the silliness crept back in a bit as the series progressed. I think you can argue that the whole mind control thing was a little bit over the top. But at the end of the day, Dory was on a lot of drugs and she had been psychologically weakened by Chip's abuse. So I did find it somewhat plausible, and I liked how those scenes were shot. I thought it was very visually interesting. But what I can't explain away is stuff like the girl at the ice cream parlour who somehow mistakes Kolis Gozer for Susan Sarandon. That just does not seem possible to me unless she has some kind of undisclosed severe sight impairment. And generally, I didn't really like any of the stories surrounding Chip's extended family, and that whole episode where the gang visits the factory that they own just didn't do anything for me. Let's talk about Drew for a minute, because this is a character that I've really come to love, particularly over the last two seasons. And I was quite surprised by his confession in Season 4 that he is still in love with Dory, because it seemed to me towards the end of Season 3 that their relationship was definitively over. But apparently not, and I'm not really sure how I feel about that, because Dory has never respected him and never been particularly nice to him, so I feel like he can really do a lot better. But as this series has demonstrated countless times, sometimes people do make self-destructive choices. I like Drew moving to that legally distinct version of Disneyland. I can totally imagine him trying to counteract the unpleasantness of Keith's death and the resulting trial by really immersing himself in this whimsical theme park world. And I like that the idea extends further and that maybe everyone at the park is running from something. Obviously we hear Cindy's story about the baby and the rollerblades, which I think is the darkest this show has ever been. I mean, that was utterly horrifying. And John Reynolds absolutely nailed his reaction. You could see just the complete shock and disbelief written all over his face. It was really well done. The relationship between him and Cindy was a solid, if not spectacular, subplot, but in my eyes it was all worth it for that incredible when you know proposal scene towards the end of the season, which was just so incredibly absurd in every way, and I was in stitches. I loved it. I'm just going to mention Elliot and Portia very briefly because sadly I don't have a lot to say about them this season. I think their story arcs were okay, but both of them felt quite disposable and inconsequential. I think because Dory was in such a dark place, the writers kind of used Elliot and Portia to lighten the tone a little bit, but because of that, their arcs just don't feel like they have a lot of depth. As for Chantal, having her story as a self-contained bottle episode I think actually worked quite well, because I think her scenes in season 3 did sometimes feel a little bit out of place. The only downside was, because the character is so extremely unlikable, it was kind of tough spending a full 25 minutes with her, and towards the end I needed a fucking break. But I think the idea of her writing this incredibly misguided book, having the emotional intelligence of a 10-year-old and inadvertently getting famous, that was all good stuff and very in keeping with that character's journey. Because when you think about it, Chantal is constantly wandering into situations without even the slightest clue what is actually going on around her, and the results are entertainingly calamitous every time. Let's do some quick shout-outs now, starting with Anne Dowd, because she really is just great in everything, and this was no exception. We need justice for Paula Jo next season, because her death was really quite disturbing. That scene shook me up just a little bit. Meanwhile, Connor Ratliff has been quietly stealing scenes in the role of Ted since season 1, and I think it's about time he got some recognition. This character has always been just such a hilarious, creepy weirdo, and I love how much they played into that this season by having him become obsessed with hallucinogenic drugs. I could totally believe that as a natural progression for him. It was so nice to see Julian again. I think Brandon Michael Hall is such a charming guy, and I wish they could have kept him around a little bit more in season 3, because it would have been great to see him as a journalist covering Dory's trial and diving into all her many, many lies. I'm sad we missed out on that, but hey, maybe he could come back in a larger role next season, because he's not starring in any other TV shows at the moment as far as I'm aware. And on that note, let's talk about the future of Search Party. Going into this season, I had assumed that it was intended to be the final one. Apparently that's not the case, because Search Party has just been renewed for season 5. But I have to say, I kind of wanted it to end here. Let me explain. There was a real feeling of finality in season 4, and a lot of things coming full circle. So for example, in season 1 there's that great line where Dory says, "I feel like everybody can tell me what I can't do, and nobody can tell me what I can do." Well, in this season, her friends finally figure out what it is she could have done with her life in that quite moving kind of fantasy sequence. And of course there's also the scene where Chantal encounters the missing poster of Dory in a really great little inversion of the opening scene of the entire series. These kinds of moments made it feel like the story of Search Party was coming to quite a natural conclusion, and that was also reflected in what was, in my opinion, the least interesting ending to date. The first 3 seasons of Search Party all ended on some really intriguing cliffhangers, but the ending to season 4 barely even qualifies as a cliffhanger in my opinion. I mean, sure, it's open-ended in the sense that we don't find out exactly what Dory does next after being saved from the fire, but I think it's fairly obvious that she would come out of that experience with a renewed appreciation for her life and for her friends, that she'd probably get back together with Drew and get her life back on track. For that reason, I don't think we need to see a whole 5th season where some other contrived crisis is thrown at the group. And my other concern is that while the quality of Search Party is still good, it has certainly dipped a little since season 2, which I consider to be the peak. And I really don't want it to get to a point where the show just stops being good. You know, in my opinion, it's better to leave people wanting more than to outstay your welcome. So I just really hope that Search Party doesn't drop the ball in season 5. So those are my thoughts on Search Party season 4. Let me know your opinion on the latest episodes in the comments section below. Please do consider liking or subscribing if you enjoyed the video, and I really hope to see you next time.